At dinner, my mother held out a shining key fob and pressed it into my younger sister's hand with a proud smile, announcing to the table that the $120,000 Tesla was her reward for graduating, and while relatives clapped and my sister's cheeks flushed with joy, I sat frozen with my fork still in my hand, watching the glow of the chandelier sparkle in my water glass as though even the light itself had joined in her celebration, and then, without hesitation or the faintest sense of balance, my mother turned toward me, and in the same sweet voice that had moments ago crowned my sister with glory, she told me that next month I owed $1,200 in rent, leaving me to swallow humiliation with the taste of overcooked steak and to feel the laughter around the table roll over me like a tide that carried everyone else forward while I sank quietly in my chair. If you have ever been through something that cuts deep in public while the people who should defend you are the ones striking, then you will understand why I share this moment with you, and why even the smallest comment, or a simple like, means more than you can imagine. My name is Sophie Parker. I am 27 years old, and until that night I had believed that being quiet, steady, and helpful would one day earn me peace. But the polished table of that suburban bistro taught me differently, showing me that silence often paints a target rather than protection. And as I watched my mother beam at my sister with the sunniest of smiles while holding the key fob aloft for pictures, I forced my own lips into a polite curve, clapped along with the relatives, and played my role as the supportive older sister, yet inside a storm brewed that did not roar with thunder, but whispered with a steady wind, "Enough, enough, enough," until it filled me so completely that I could barely taste dessert, and every congratulatory toast sounded like another small cut on skin already raw. The ride home was filled with cheerful chatter about playlists for the Tesla and future weekend drives, while I pressed my forehead to the cold glass of the car window, wondering if my mother even realized she had humiliated me in public, or if the disregard was so casual that it barely registered in her mind. And when we pulled into the driveway of the house I had helped keep clean, supplied with groceries, and warmed with my labor, I walked down the hall to my room and looked at the posters from high school still clinging to the walls and the second-hand novels stuffed onto a shelf, and I knew in that instant that the air in those walls had shrunk too small for me to breathe. Without words or accusations, without slammed doors or angry speeches, I packed the duffel bag I had kept discreetly ready with a few clothes and my charger, zipped it softly, slid the strap onto my shoulder, and walked down the hall while laughter still spilled from the living room as if I were already invisible to them. The night air was cool and smelled faintly of cut grass, the porch light casting a pale circle as I stepped into the quiet. And though I had expected shaking hands or hot tears, what I felt was a calm clarity, as though a curtain had finally lifted from my life. So I slipped into my old sedan with its rattling engine and mismatched seats, turned the ignition, and drove away without looking back at the windows, glowing warmly behind me. Because I knew they were not home anymore, but only a stage set where I had played the role of background character for too long. And though I had no plan beyond a friend's couch and a small hope that I would figure out the rest, I also knew that by leaving that night I was no longer bound to their script, and that while I could not yet imagine the 6 months ahead or the 35 missed calls that would one day appear on my phone, I understood one thing with sharp certainty. The quietest exits often echo the loudest when the time comes to return. The first night away from home was not glamorous in the slightest, because I ended up on the lumpy couch of a college friend who lived in a cramped apartment above a laundromat, and while the hum of the dryers downstairs rattled the floorboards, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling with my duffel bag as my pillow, thinking about how strange it felt to be free and lost at the same time. Yet when the morning sun pushed through the thin curtains and painted stripes across my face, I realized that even this restless sleep tasted better than the suffocating comfort of my mother's house, because for the first time in years I could breathe without waiting for the next reminder that I was never enough. I took the bus to work that day, clutching a travel mug of instant coffee, my phone buzzing with group chat photos of my sister posing with her new car, and though a pang of envy pricked at me, I also smiled faintly because my ride cost $2 and bought me more dignity than that glossy key ever would. The days blurred into a rhythm of exhaustion and small victories, with shifts at the office followed by evenings dog walking for extra cash. My shoes wearing thin, but my spirit slowly toughening, and when I finally saved enough for a tiny studio apartment with a view of a brick wall, I felt an odd thrill decorating it with thrift store finds and mismatched dishes that somehow fit together in their imperfection. My nightstand was nothing more than a laundry basket flipped upside down with a coaster on top, yet I laughed at how proud I felt setting down a lamp and calling it furniture. And even though my dinners were often just pasta reheated for the third time, I seasoned them with a pinch of freedom that made every bite feel like a feast. In the quiet of that space, with no one to criticize or compare me, I began to rebuild my sense of self, one small routine at a time, discovering that survival could feel like progress if you measured it against what you had left behind. Still, the shadow of my family lingered on the edges of my days, because every notification from their group chat showed my sister's new adventures, road trips to the coast, brunch photos under chandeliers, captions full of praise from relatives who never once asked how I was managing, and the contrast was sharp enough to make my chest ache. Yet as much as it stung, I found a certain strength in scrolling through those pictures while sipping my cheap coffee in a chipped mug, because I knew that each grin behind the Tesla's wheel was built on the silence of the trust I had carried all my life, the unspoken rule that Sophie takes care of herself while everyone else takes the rewards. And in that awareness, something hardened in me, not as bitterness, but as resolve that their story would no longer define mine. It was during one of those quiet evenings, sitting cross-legged on the floor beside a wobbly table I had rescued from the curb, that I opened my banking app to track my dwindling balance, and my eyes caught a line item I had never noticed before, a small but regular withdrawal labeled Harper Family Education Trust. At first I thought it was some obscure banking fee or a clerical mistake, but the name echoed like a bell because my grandfather's last name was Harper, and I had never once been told about any trust connected to our family. My heart quickened as I stared at the screen, the numbers glowing in the dim light of my little studio, and though I had no idea what it meant, a flicker of curiosity sparked in the ashes of my exhaustion, whispering that maybe, just maybe, leaving home had led me not only to freedom, but also to a hidden trail I was finally ready to follow. The weeks that followed felt like standing outside in the cold while watching a party through a glass window, because every time I opened social media, I was confronted with another glowing photo of my younger sister beside her new Tesla, her hair freshly styled, her nails polished, her smile rehearsed into perfection, and every caption was written like a press release, full of hashtags about hard work and gratitude, though the only hard work she had ever done was deciding which filter made her look more angelic. The comments from relatives poured in by the dozens, all of them calling her inspiring, responsible, even selfless, and I sat there on the futon in my tiny studio, twirling a fork through reheated pasta, wondering if any of those relatives realized they were cheering for a girl whose car had been handed to her like candy, while her sister sat in silence with rent bills and no safety net. The contrast gnawed at me with each scroll, and though I tried to laugh about it, telling myself that no car could buy maturity or depth, my chest tightened with every photo, because it wasn't just about her showing off. It was about the story my mother was feeding to the world, that one daughter was worth celebrating and the other was worth charging. At work, I tried to bury myself in spreadsheets and phone calls, but the imbalance followed me like a shadow, because whenever coworkers made harmless jokes about my outdated blouses or the way I carried lunch in plastic bags instead of sleek bento boxes, I couldn't help but think about how my sister would never have to deal with that kind of ridicule, not because she was stronger, but because she had been cushioned from it by our mother's favoritism. On weekends, I walked dogs through neighborhoods where the mailboxes were fancier than my furniture, watching golden retrievers trot proudly in collars that probably cost more than my monthly groceries. And while I laughed at the absurdity of scooping after animals whose owners drove luxury cars, the laughter always faded quickly into a hollow quiet once I returned to my studio. My space was filled with mismatched furniture from thrift shops and donations, yet even in its imperfection, it felt like mine, a place where no one compared me to someone else, and that small dignity kept me steady when envy threatened to consume me. Still, each time I checked my bank account and saw the withdrawal labeled Harper Family Education Trust, a question dug deeper into my mind, because if this trust was tied to my grandfather, then why was I living on noodles and dollar coffee while my sister lived like royalty? My mother's messages during that time became shorter, sharper, as though each word had been filed into a knife before being sent, and the tone carried that smug suggestion that I had chosen my circumstances, that I had walked away from comfort simply to make life harder on myself. I wanted to scream back that there had been no comfort in living under her roof, only the slow erosion of my worth. But I bit my tongue as I always did, convincing myself that silence was still the safest path. Yet the silence that once felt protective was now starting to feel like a cage, because every cutting word, every photo of my sister basking in praise, built another brick in the wall that separated me from them. And the higher the wall grew, the more I realized that I was not meant to climb over it, but to burn it down with truth. The way my mother flaunted my sister's achievements to the extended family, praising her endlessly at gatherings while barely acknowledging my efforts, no longer just hurt. It revealed a carefully built narrative where I was cast as the independent one, the child who needed less so they could justify giving me nothing, and once I saw that pattern, I could not unsee it. The thought that haunted me most, the one that surfaced during long bus rides home when the city lights blurred through the scratched windows, was not simply that my family favored her, but that the Tesla itself, the gleaming car that represented their affection, had been bought in part with funds that should have belonged to me as well. I remember one particular ride when my reflection in the glass stared back at me with hollow eyes, and I whispered a single question under my breath. What if that trust wasn't just some random account? What if it had once included me, and someone had quietly erased me from it? The idea lodged in my chest like a spark threatening to grow into a fire, and though the thought scared me because it meant my struggles had been engineered rather than accidental, it also electrified me, because if it were true, then everything I had endured could be traced back to deliberate choices made by people who claimed to love me. For the first time in years, the exhaustion that weighed on me began to shift into something sharper, something angrier, not the wild anger that burns out quickly, but the slow, steady kind that fuels action. And as I stepped off the bus that night and walked toward my drafty apartment, I knew that silence was no longer enough, because if there was a truth hidden in those withdrawals, I was going to find it, and when I did, they would never look at me the same way again. Curiosity is a funny thing, because it starts as a whisper you think you can ignore, yet before long it grows so loud that it drowns out everything else. And that was exactly what happened with the strange withdrawal I kept seeing in my bank statements, the one labeled Harper Family Education Trust. At first I tried to convince myself it was a glitch, some random technical error, but the name Harper pressed against my thoughts like a finger tapping on glass, reminding me that it was my grandfather's surname, a man who had been stern but fair, and who had once told me that he wanted both of his granddaughters to have equal chances in life. The more I remembered his words, the more impossible it seemed that he would create something like a trust for only one of us. So one afternoon during my lunch break, I decided to stop wondering and start searching. I walked into the county records office with my heart pounding like I was sneaking into a secret vault, though all I carried was a stack of curiosity and a few crumpled dollars for the copy machine. The office smelled like dust and old coffee, with file cabinets lined up like soldiers and clerks tapping away at keyboards, and I felt a little out of place in my wrinkled blouse and budget shoes. But I reminded myself that information didn't care about appearances. I gave the clerk my grandfather's name and waited while she scrolled through the database, And when she raised an eyebrow and asked if I knew about the Harper Family Education Trust, I tried to keep my face calm even as my pulse raced. She handed me a printout, and there it was in black and white, a trust established years ago by my grandfather, specifically for the education and advancement of both his granddaughters, with conditions that required transparency and equal distribution. The words seemed to glow on the page, both comforting and infuriating, because here was the proof that my grandfather had wanted fairness. And yet, here I was, sitting in a studio apartment with a broken toaster, while my sister cruised around in a luxury car. I fed quarters into the copy machine, and of course it jammed twice, spitting out crumpled paper like a cranky child refusing vegetables. But I coaxed it back into life and left with a small pile of documents that felt heavier than bricks in my hands. As I walked back to the office with the papers tucked under my arm, I couldn't stop replaying every memory of my mother dismissing me as independent, strong, self-sufficient, all those labels she had used to explain why my sister needed more help, and suddenly they felt less like compliments and more like excuses. The pattern began to reveal itself like threads of a hidden tapestry. My mother had taken the story of my independence and twisted it into justification for siphoning resources toward my sister, and she had done it so smoothly that nobody questioned her. I felt sick at the thought, but I also felt the faintest flicker of power, because if I could see the pattern, then I could break it. That night, I spread the papers out on the wobbly table in my apartment, tracing my finger along the clauses that spoke of fairness and accountability, and one line made me stop cold. The trustee was required to conduct annual audits and report equal support to both beneficiaries. Equal support, two words that pierced me like sunlight through a storm cloud, because they proved that this wasn't about me being lazy or incapable. It was about a deliberate failure to honor my grandfather's wishes. My exhaustion melted into determination as I stared at that sentence, and for the first time since I had walked away from my mother's house, I felt like I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was holding the first piece of a puzzle that could change everything. I didn't yet know how far this would go or what battles I would face, but I knew one thing clearly. My silence was ending, and my mother's careful story was about to unravel thread by thread. When I first laid those documents out across my wobbly little table, the thin wood bowing slightly under the weight of papers and highlighted printouts, I felt both overwhelmed and strangely powerful, because even though the legal language curled and twisted into phrases meant to intimidate ordinary people, I could sense a truth buried in them, a rhythm that spoke louder than the jargon. And as I traced line after line with a dull yellow highlighter borrowed from the office supply closet, I began to see the story my grandfather had wanted told. He had written words like equal access, equal opportunity, equal support, repeating them like a mantra, and those words stood in stark contrast to the life I was living. A life of hand-me-down clothes, 2 jobs stacked together just to cover bills, dinners made of leftovers stretched thin, while across town, my sister posted smiling photos from the driver's seat of her luxury car. The disparity was so sharp it made my stomach twist, but in that twist grew something new, something strong. The decision that I would not let those words sit idle on yellowed paper, while my reality was reduced to scraps, that I would gather every shred of proof until even my mother could not twist them into excuses. So I began with what I knew best: order and persistence. On my battered old laptop, its keys smoothed shiny from years of use, I opened a blank spreadsheet and started building columns like soldiers lined up for battle. Into one side, I entered every record of withdrawals I could trace to my sister, not just the glaring payments tied to the Tesla, but tuition checks, deposits marked for travel enrichment, even monthly transfers labeled wellness, amounts that together formed a mountain so high it made me dizzy. Into the other side, I entered what had ever landed in my account, and those numbers looked laughable in comparison, almost like an insult, as if someone had tossed me crumbs to prove they hadn't forgotten me entirely. I color-coded them, blue for her, green for me, and when I stepped back, the sheet looked like a child's art project, one side drowning in ink, while the other side blinked with a few lonely dots. Every update I made filled me with a sense of control, as if organizing the truth into tidy rows gave me a weapon I had never held before. And soon my small apartment floor was covered with receipts, screenshots, sticky notes, and printed statements, the chaos of proof slowly shaping itself into clarity. But I knew that clarity on its own was not enough, that truth only carried weight if someone besides me could recognize it. So one evening after work, I gathered my courage, stuffed the thick folder under my arm, and walked into a free legal aid clinic located in a peeling brick building sandwiched between a pawn shop and a pharmacy. The waiting room smelled faintly of old carpet and disinfectant, and the plastic chairs squeaked when I shifted nervously. But when a young attorney finally called my name and led me to her office, I laid the folder on her desk like it was both a shield and a confession. She flipped through the pages, her brows furrowed in concentration, and after a few long minutes she looked up, her voice calm but steady, and told me that I might indeed have standing as a beneficiary if the trustee had failed to ensure fairness. I clutched those words like they were oxygen, because for so long I had been told I was imagining slights, exaggerating unfairness, or simply ungrateful. Yet here was a professional, a stranger, with no reason to comfort me, confirming that my instincts carried weight. I walked out of that office with a list of next steps, a handful of pamphlets about beneficiary rights, and a hope I hadn't felt in years, the kind of hope that makes your knees weak but your spine straighten. That night, back in my small studio, I spread everything out again, the spreadsheets glowing faintly on my laptop screen, the highlighted pages, the sticky notes curling at the corners. And for the first time, I did not feel like a victim piecing together scraps, but like an investigator preparing for a trial only I could see coming. I thought about the temptation to confront my mother immediately, to throw the papers down in front of her and demand an explanation. But I knew how that would end, with denials, with gaslighting, with accusations of jealousy or betrayal, and so instead, I made myself a quiet promise. I would stay silent until my silence no longer protected her, but protected me. I tucked the documents into labeled folders, made digital backups on a cheap flash drive I kept hidden inside an old coffee can, and wrote myself reminders to check bank statements weekly. Sitting there in the dim glow of a thrift store lamp, I realized something that made me smile despite everything. My mother had always mistaken my quiet nature for weakness, but as I looked at the growing pile of evidence, I understood for the first time that quiet was not weakness at all. Quiet could be sharp, quiet could be patient, quiet could wait until the perfect moment to cut through lies like a blade, and when that moment came, I would be ready. The more I organized my notes, the more the picture sharpened, and soon the faint suspicion that had followed me since that first odd bank notification became something undeniable. Because the Tesla, that gleaming monument to my mother's favoritism, was not just a graduation present paid from her savings or some generous family contribution, it was tangled directly into the trust. I traced the paper trail late into the night, my desk littered with coffee-stained pages and highlighted lines, and there it was, a disbursement marked as special allocation, leaving the trust just days before my sister had posted her first photo with the car. My heart pounded as I stared at the words, the glow of my laptop screen illuminating the realization that what had been painted as a gift of love was in fact a misuse of funds that were meant to serve us equally. Suddenly, every mile my sister drove, every smug photo she shared, every caption about hard work and rewards felt like a theft pulled directly from under my feet. The deeper I dug, the more threads appeared, and each one wrapped around the Tesla like vines choking a tree. Lease documents filed under my mother's name showed she had signed with the trust as guarantor, using language about educational advancement that would have made my grandfather roll in his grave, because no clause in those papers could twist a luxury car into an academic necessity. I sat with my head in my hands, laughing bitterly at the absurdity of it all, because apparently in my mother's dictionary, the word education translated into leather seats, a panoramic sunroof, and vanity plates. The irony bit deep, but beneath the sting there was a growing strength, because this was no longer just about favoritism or neglect. It was about deliberate misuse, something that left footprints too large to be denied. What struck me hardest wasn't only the financial betrayal, but the emotional betrayal hidden inside it, because for years I had been told that I was too independent, too capable, too resourceful to need help. Yet here was proof that the money meant to level the playing field had been siphoned into luxuries my sister flaunted daily. My mind reeled with memories. My mother telling me to toughen up when I struggled to pay for textbooks, my sister's smug grin when relatives praised her dedication, my own late nights working 2 jobs to cover bills while my mother tucked away trust funds for chrome rims and autopilot upgrades. Each memory fused with the evidence until my anger crystallized into something steadier, something that didn't burn me from the inside but lit a path forward. Still, I knew I couldn't afford recklessness. If I revealed my discovery too soon, my mother would bury me in denials, twisting every fact until I doubted my own sanity again. But if I stayed patient, gathering every scrap, then one day the truth would burst out in a way she couldn't contain. So I kept quiet, filing each document, snapping photos of lease agreements, copying records into my growing archive, and I carried on with my daily life as though nothing had changed. On the outside, I was still the quiet daughter scraping by in a studio apartment, eating pasta and walking dogs. But inside, I was sharpening a blade made of paper and ink, and each time my sister posted another photo beside that Tesla, her smile so wide it could split glass, I whispered to myself that one day the car that symbolized my humiliation would become the very proof of my vindication. The more I uncovered, the heavier the weight on my shoulders became, because holding the truth without yet being able to act on it was exhausting. And there were nights when I sat on the floor of my studio surrounded by papers and spreadsheets, wondering if I was strong enough to keep going. My mother had spent years teaching me that my silence made me powerless, but now I was beginning to realize that my quiet gave me time to observe, to plan, to line up each fact until the pattern could no longer be denied. Still, the loneliness of carrying it alone was real, and sometimes it felt like standing at the edge of a cliff with no one beside me. I remember one evening when the city outside my window buzzed with life, car horns blaring and laughter spilling from bars down the street, while I stayed inside with a single lamp burning, reviewing receipts for the 100th time. My sister had just posted another photo of herself with the Tesla, parked outside a rooftop restaurant, captioned with words about blessings and hard work, and though anger prickled at me, I also smiled bitterly, because little did she know her precious car was fast becoming my strongest piece of evidence. That thought steadied me, reminding me that all the long hours, all the sacrifices, all the nights I had eaten pasta alone, were building toward something larger than survival. They were building toward justice. What kept me pushing through was the knowledge that the truth, once revealed, could never be stuffed back into silence again. And as much as I wanted to slam the documents on the table in front of my mother right then, I understood that patience was my ally, that timing would decide whether the truth whispered or thundered. So I carried on, living my modest life, working my shifts, feeding myself with whatever I could afford, while secretly I was gathering a case brick by brick. It was a strange kind of double life. On the outside, the struggling daughter who barely made rent. On the inside, the careful investigator building the file that would one day expose everything. And maybe that is why I tell this story now, because I know how heavy it feels to carry injustice in silence, and I also know how powerful it feels when someone listens. If you've ever been the quiet one in your family, the one expected to handle everything alone, you'll understand why these words matter so much to me. If you want to let me know you hear me, a simple comment or a quick like is more than enough. But what matters most is that we keep walking this path together, because with every step I take closer to the truth, I carry not only my fight, but the reminder that no quiet voice is truly powerless. It was a gray Saturday afternoon when I drove across town to visit my Aunt Margaret, the only relative who had ever treated me with something close to fairness. And though I told her I had just come to help her sort through old boxes in her attic, Deep down, I think I was hoping to stumble across something that would fill the holes in my growing puzzle. The attic was dim, the single bulb overhead flickering, the air thick with the smell of cedar and dust, and as we dug through cardboard boxes filled with faded photo albums, brittle receipts, and souvenirs from family trips long forgotten, I pulled open a small carton labeled Simply Estate. Inside was a thin folder tucked beneath a stack of tax forms, and when I slid it free and unfolded the pages, my breath caught. There, in my grandfather's unmistakably neat handwriting, was a photocopy of a letter addressed directly to the trustee of the Hoppe Family Education Trust. I lowered myself onto the creaky attic floor, cross-legged with the paper trembling in my hands, and began to read, each line pulling me deeper into the truth I had both feared and longed to find. The letter was clear and unyielding, written with the kind of precision my grandfather had always carried in his voice, and it stated plainly that both of his granddaughters must be given equal educational support, that any major disbursement beyond a certain amount was to be matched with an equivalent opportunity for the other, and that the purpose of the trust was to preserve fairness above all else. As I read those words, emotion crashed over me so hard I could barely breathe, because I felt his presence in the ink as though he were standing behind me, whispering across years that he had seen me, that he had cared about my future, that he had wanted me to rise just as much as he wanted my sister to shine. But then my eyes caught on a scrawled note in the margin, not in his handwriting, but in the hand of the trustee, and the ache in my chest sharpened into rage. The note described a conversation with my mother, who had argued that I was independent and self-sufficient, phrases she had used for years, words that once had felt like compliments but now appeared in black and white as excuses, a twisted justification for why my sister deserved more and I supposedly needed less. I carried the folder downstairs to my aunt with shaking hands, my heart racing, and when she saw the letter, her face fell into a look of weary recognition, the kind of look that says the truth may hurt, but it no longer surprises. She admitted she had always suspected something like this, that she had seen signs of favoritism and manipulation, but had never had proof, and she explained that my mother had always been persuasive, skilled at bending people to her reasoning, convincing others that her way was best for the family. Even the trustee, bound by duty, had been swayed by her certainty, allowing her to shift the narrative until the story became that I was strong enough to fend for myself, while my sister needed constant support. Hearing my aunt say it out loud, with no hesitation, filled me with both fury and clarity, because I realized in that moment this wasn't accidental neglect, it wasn't careless favoritism, it was a deliberate betrayal, a conscious decision to weaponize my independence so she could funnel the family's resources where she wanted them. It wasn't just favoritism anymore, it was theft wrapped in manipulation. Driving home that evening with the letter tucked carefully inside a folder on the passenger seat, I felt a strange mix of calm and fire, the kind of paradox that only comes when the last piece of a long, unsolved puzzle suddenly clicks into place. The highway stretched before me in endless gray lanes, raindrops beginning to streak across the windshield, and though the world outside was muted, inside my chest the storm was loud. For years I had doubted myself, wondered if I was exaggerating, convinced myself I was simply unlucky or unworthy. But now I had proof that the imbalance had been engineered, that my struggles had been crafted not by fate, but by the choices of someone who should have protected me. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, whispering under my breath that this letter was no longer just paper, it was a weapon, the cornerstone of the reckoning my mother would never see coming. My grandfather had written fairness into existence, my mother had twisted it into favoritism, and now it was my turn to reclaim it, to honor his intentions by refusing to let her story stand. I didn't know the exact steps I would take next, but I knew one thing with certainty. This letter had shifted the balance, and from that night forward, nothing in our family would ever look the same again. Once I had my grandfather's letter safely tucked into my growing folder, the weight of the truth felt both unbearable and empowering, because holding proof meant I could no longer pretend ignorance was an option. Every evening after work, I spread my documents across the small table in my apartment, the surface barely big enough to hold them all, and I rehearsed in my mind what it would feel like to finally lay them out in front of someone who mattered. My spreadsheets had grown into a map of betrayal, columns of figures showing how thousands upon thousands had flowed toward my sister, while my share dwindled into scraps, and each highlighted clause from the trust shone like a spotlight on my mother's lies. It wasn't just paper anymore. It was a story waiting to be told, a story that couldn't be silenced with dismissive words or twisted with her clever reasoning. When the trustee finally agreed to schedule a formal review, I felt a surge of nervous energy ripple through me, the kind that made my hands tremble, but also stiffened my spine. The meeting would be held in a community room at the library, a neutral place chosen so no one could claim. The setting gave unfair advantage, and though it was just a plain space with fluorescent lights and folding chairs, to me it felt like the stage where everything would shift. I imagined my mother's face when the clauses were read aloud, my sister's reaction when she realized the Tesla she flaunted was tied to strings of deceit, and even the relatives who had cheered her on would finally hear words they could not deny. The thought both terrified me and gave me more satisfaction than I had felt in years, because for once I would not be the background character at the family table. I would be the one holding the truth. In preparation, I organized the evidence into sections, labeling each folder with careful titles so that nothing could be brushed aside as confusion. I made copies of every transaction, every lease agreement, every note from the records office, and tucked the original letter into a plastic sleeve as though it were a holy text. I even practiced what I might say if given the chance to speak, scribbling sentences in a notebook late into the night, sometimes crossing them out angrily, sometimes underlining them twice because they captured exactly what I wanted to express. My small studio looked like the headquarters of a detective, papers pinned with sticky notes, timelines taped to the wall, flash drives hidden in coffee cans, and in the midst of it all I sat quietly, sipping dollar coffee and smiling at the absurdity of my modest life transforming into a battleground where truth would finally stand tall. The morning of the meeting, as I dressed in my cleanest blouse and straightened my second-hand blazer, my phone buzzed on the counter, lighting up with one notification after another until the screen nearly glowed. 35 missed calls from family. I stared at it in silence, my stomach tightening as I realized word must have reached them that the review was happening. Panic had clearly spread through their ranks, because only fear could explain such relentless attempts to reach me, and for the first time in my life, it wasn't me chasing their attention. It was them chasing mine. I slipped the phone into my bag without answering, tucked the folder of evidence under my arm, and walked out into the cool morning air with steady steps. Whatever awaited me in that library room, I knew one thing clearly. The story my mother had built was about to collapse, and I was the one carrying the receipts. The 35 missed calls sitting on my phone that morning were more than unanswered numbers. They were the sound of panic echoing through a family that had spent years dismissing me. A family that now found themselves staring into the mirror of their own lies. I hadn't picked up a single call, yet I could almost see the scene playing out in the house I had left behind. My sister pacing back and forth with her Tesla key fob gripped like a lifeline, her face twisted with anger, while my mother barked orders into the phone and tried to craft a new story fast enough to outrun the truth. For years I had lived in the shadow of their attention, begging for scraps of acknowledgement, but now the roles had shifted completely, and their frantic voices crashed against the silence I held onto like a shield. It was a strange reversal. The woman who once insisted I owed her rent was now the one desperate to reach me, and her persistence only proved that the power she had always clutched was slipping from her fingers. Later that evening, when I finally listened to the voicemails, the frantic mosaic of their unraveling came through loud and clear. My sister's message was the first, her voice sharp and shrill, accusing me of ruining everything and demanding to know why the trustee had started poking around about her car. Her words tumbled out in a rush, fueled by entitlement and fear, the sound of someone who had always believed the world owed her comfort and was now shocked to feel the ground shift beneath her. Then came my mother's voice, shifting like a storm between thunder and drizzle. In one breath, commanding me to call her back, immediately, without delay, and in the next softening into false sweetness, insisting she could fix everything if only I would talk to her before it was too late. She never said too late for what, but the desperation in her tone made it clear, too late to stop the truth from reaching ears that mattered more than hers. Even cousins and aunts chimed in with hesitant messages, their voices laced with confusion, as if they could sense a scandal brewing, but hadn't yet understood how deep the betrayal ran. What pierced me most wasn't their panic, but the bitter irony of hearing my mother's voice twisting itself into a performance I knew by heart. She claimed she was being misunderstood, that outsiders were meddling in private family affairs, and that I, poor gullible Sophie, had been manipulated into stirring up chaos. The gaslighting was so familiar it almost made me laugh, because she had used it for years to keep me in line. But now, instead of sounding convincing, it sounded hollow, a cheap imitation of control from a woman who had lost the script. She wasn't trying to persuade me anymore, not really. She was rehearsing lies to soothe herself, desperate to believe she could still pull the strings. And I realized in that moment how much power she had only because I had believed her versions of reality for so long. Stripped of that belief, she was just another person, flailing in the quicksand of her own making, and I finally understood that her greatest fear wasn't losing money, it was losing face, the image she had polished for years. The generous, wise, self-sacrificing mother was crumbling, and nothing terrified her more than being exposed as the opposite. On the morning of the review, I stood in front of the mirror in my small studio, smoothing the wrinkles out of my thrift store blouse, and stared at the reflection of a woman I barely recognized. Not because I looked different, but because the weight in my eyes had shifted. 6 months earlier, I had sat at a restaurant table humiliated, my sister glowing with new keys in her hand, while I was handed nothing but a bill. And later that night, I had packed quietly and driven into the unknown with nothing but a duffel bag and scraps of dignity. Now I stood tall, with a folder full of documents, a letter from my grandfather that spoke louder than any excuse, and the calm knowledge that their frantic calls were not a sign of their power, but a sign of their fear. As another call buzzed across the screen, I pressed the phone face down on the counter, slipped the evidence into my bag, and whispered to myself that the crash had already begun. They had spent years writing me out of the story, but today I was walking into that library room to make sure their fall was not just private, but undeniable. And by the time the meeting ended, the silence that once protected them would be gone forever. The library's community room was nothing glamorous. Just beige walls, flickering fluorescent lights, a stack of folding chairs, and a table that smelled faintly of old polish. Yet to me, it felt like the grandest courtroom I could ever stand in. I sat at one side with my folder resting squarely in front of me, the papers inside arranged so carefully that I could find any page with a flick of my hand, while across from me, my mother and sister entered together, their faces pale with strain, yet still carrying the defiance they had worn like armor for years. My mother's jaw was tight, her purse clutched against her side, as though it could shield her from the storm she had brewed, and my sister looked less radiant than usual, her eyes darting nervously, the shimmer of her confidence dimming as reality settled over her. The trustee sat at the head of the table, calm and collected, and beside him my Aunt Margaret leaned forward with her lips pressed together in quiet resolve. For a moment the room was silent, except for the shuffle of papers, but beneath that silence I could feel the weight of something momentous pressing against us all. The trustee began speaking in a voice that was steady, deliberate, and impossible to ignore, reading directly from the trust documents, each clause falling like a stone in water, sending ripples of discomfort through the room. He spoke of equal support, equal opportunity, equal accountability, my grandfather's words carved into the very foundation of the trust. And as those words echoed off the plain walls, I watched my sister shrink in her chair, her once proud shoulders rounding as if each sentence were stripping another layer of entitlement away. My mother's smile, usually so polished and unwavering, began to twitch at the corners, and I saw her shift in her seat, tugging at her sleeve as though the fabric itself might offer an escape. The trustee's voice carried no judgment, only fact, yet those facts sliced sharper than any accusation could, and when he laid out the record of disbursements, the thousands funneled into luxury purchases under the guise of advancement, my mother's eyes flickered with something I had never seen before: fear. Then came the formal pronouncement, and though the trustee spoke in the same calm tone, his words thundered through me. He explained that corrective action was mandatory, that the trust had been misused in ways that directly violated its purpose, and that every misstep would be rectified. The Tesla, once the gleaming prize held up as proof of my mother's generosity, would no longer stand untouched. It would either be restructured so its value was balanced with an equivalent educational opportunity for me, or replaced entirely with support that matched in worth. In addition, my mother would be required to reimburse the trust for misused funds and to submit to ongoing oversight to ensure transparency in the future. My sister let out an audible gasp, her face flushing deep red, her lips parting as if she might argue, but no words came out. My mother gripped the sides of her chair until her knuckles whitened, and I sat still, my own hands calm on the folder, the storm that had raged inside me for years finally quieting into something deeper: vindication. But the sharpest twist came at the very end, when the trustee turned another page and revealed a clause that none of us had anticipated. My grandfather, in his cautious wisdom, had named a backup co-trustee to step in if fairness ever faltered. That name, spoken aloud with quiet authority, was my Aunt Margaret. My mother's face drained of color completely, her mouth falling open in disbelief, while my aunt straightened in her chair, her eyes clear with the authority she had been denied for so long. The family members who had gathered in the back of the room, along with a librarian who had paused by the doorway, all became silent witnesses to the unraveling of my mother's carefully spun story. In that moment, everything shifted. The matriarch who once humiliated me in public was now the one stripped bare in front of her peers, her reputation collapsing not in whispers but in full view of others. I sat there and let the moment sink in, not gloating, not mocking, just breathing in the sweetness of justice finally spoken aloud. For the first time, I was not the quiet extra at the family table. I was the voice holding the truth, and the truth had set me free. Walking out of that library room, folder pressed against my chest like a shield finally lowered, I felt a lightness in my steps that I hadn't known in years. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and distant wood smoke, and for the first time in my adult life, I wasn't thinking about how to survive the next bill or whether my family would ever see me. I was thinking about what came next, on my own terms. With the trustees ruling behind me and my aunt now named as co-trustee, I knew the days of manipulation were over. My sister would have to face the reality that her shiny Tesla came with strings she could no longer cut, and my mother, for all her clever words, had been bound by the very rules she thought she could twist. The balance had shifted, and it no longer tilted against me. The funds from the trust were restructured within weeks, and instead of a luxury car or extravagant trips, I received something far more valuable: the support I had once been denied. I used it to enroll in a certification program I had long dreamed about, one that promised a stable career and benefits I had never known. With that opportunity came the freedom to move into a modest but bright apartment of my own, where the walls were lined not with second-hand posters from childhood, but with shelves I had chosen myself, books stacked proudly like old friends. I furnished the place with simple, sturdy pieces, nothing flashy, but every lamp and chair felt like a declaration. This is mine, chosen by me, paid for with resources I should have always had access to. I found myself smiling at small things, matching mugs in my cupboard, A desk that didn't wobble, curtains that actually blocked the light. These details, trivial to some, felt like victory banners to me. Meanwhile, my sister was forced to confront life without the cushion she had always taken for granted. Payments for the Tesla were no longer automatically covered, and suddenly her carefree rides and endless brunches slowed to a crawl as she wrestled with budgets she had never learned to keep. She resented me for it at first, her messages dripping with blame, but beneath her words I heard something new, the sting of reality she had been shielded from for too long. My mother fared even worse, her image within the family fractured beyond repair, whispers spreading about the truth exposed at the review. She repaid what she owed the trust under close supervision from my aunt, and though she still carried herself with pride in public, I could see the cracks in her posture whenever our paths crossed. For years she had lived as the unquestioned authority, but now she was a woman reduced to explaining, apologizing, covering tracks she could no longer hide. As for me, I didn't need revenge in the flashy sense. My justice was quieter, but far sweeter. The knowledge that fairness had been restored, that my grandfather's wishes had finally been honored, and that I had reclaimed the dignity I thought I had lost. I drove past my mother's house once in a reliable used car I had chosen myself, the windows rolled down, the wind in my hair, and instead of bitterness, I felt only gratitude that I had walked away the night she humiliated me. Sometimes strength is not in shouting, not in fighting loudly, but in knowing when to leave quietly and build something better. And if there's one truth I carry with me now, it's this: never mistake quiet for weak, because silence has a way of gathering strength. And when it finally speaks, it speaks with the power of justice. If you've stayed with me through this whole story, thank you from the bottom of my heart. These stories take a lot out of me to tell, but knowing you're here makes it worth every word. If it touched something in you, please take a moment to hit that like button, drop a comment about what part spoke to you most, and subscribe so we can keep walking through these stories together. Your support isn't just numbers on a screen, it's what gives me the strength to keep sharing, and I'd love to know I'm not alone in this.